Hello, welcome along to a brand new Fun Kids Science Weekly. This is the only podcast that has a real search of the solar system that finds any science secrets squirreling away within. My name is Dan, and let's get to it. This week, we'll answer some of your questions. You can always send them as a voice note to me on the free Fun Kids app. And we're trying to find out how fish manage to breathe even though they're, well, underwater.
Like us, fish have to get oxygen. And rather like we have our own lungs, they have an organ, a special part of their body that is specifically designed to get as much oxygen out of the water as possible, and that's called their gills.
Also, our Battle of the Sciences this week takes us into the world of cognitive neuroscience. So it's all about your brain and why it thinks the way it does.
And your brain is one of the most amazing things in your body. It's like a super powerful computer that controls absolutely everything you do, from breathing to walking, thinking and feeling.
And we're climbing trees in Indonesia to track down our dangerous Dan beast this week. So let's get going with a brand new Fun Kids Science Weekly. And we start with your science in the news. A badly burnt scroll from the Roman town of Herculaneum has been digitally unwrapped, providing the first look at what's written inside for 2,000 years. Now, the document, which looks like a big lump of charcoal really, was charred by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius back in 79 AD. And is too fragile to ever be physically opened. But scientists have done something really incredible. They've used a combination of X-ray imaging and artificial intelligence to, virtually unfurl it. They've managed to scan it, even though it's tightly packed in, and they can read it on the computer, revealing rows and columns of texts. Now, some letters are already very visible in this ancient scroll, and the team believes it's a work of philosophy, but they do say that more work is needed to make the writing fully understandable and to figure out what's inside. How brilliant is that? Bits of history that we thought were completely gone from us, that we would never be able to make out with the wonder of science and futuristic AI technology. It's like magic. We can discover what's actually happening inside, and it makes you wonder what other discoveries might we make soon. Also, worldwide planetary defense organizations are monitoring an asteroid that has a tiny risk of hitting our Earth. The European Space Agency, it said it's almost 99% sure that it will safely pass Earth on the 22nd of December 2032, but that a possible impact cannot be entirely ruled out. The probability that the asteroid, which they've called 2024 YR4, may impact Earth is about 1.3%. Astronomers have worked out it might be about 90 metres across, and if it were to hit a city, it would have the power of a nuclear bomb and cause severe damage to the populated area. But it's much more likely that YR4, this asteroid, would fall into the ocean. Even a 99% chance isn't enough for me that an asteroid might come in contact with our planet in almost 8 years' time. No, I want a full 100%, please. But again, isn't it amazing what science can do, that we can find these asteroids that are years away? And our final story this week, the world's largest and oldest iceberg, A23A, is on a direct collision course with the remote British island. It's putting wildlife at risk. Let's find out more with Professor Andrew Shepherd from Northumbria University, who has been tracking the A23 iceberg over a number of years. Andrew, thank you for joining us. Whereabouts is it roughly then in the world right now?
Well, it used to be in Antarctic waters, but it's now drifted a bit further north, and it's heading towards the island of South Georgia, which is just off the tip of South America.
I know we've spoken about this on the podcast for a number of years, kind of tracking what's happened, but just as a refresher, why has it decided to flee Antarctica? What's happened? Why is it on the loose? Just kind of run us through that.
So everybody loves icebergs, and this one is a really special one because it broke free a long, long time ago in 1986. I guess most of your listeners won't remember that, but I do. And it got stuck. It got stuck on a sandbank in the middle of the Weddell Sea. And it stayed there for about 35, 40 years. And became part of Antarctica, really, actually, for that time period. And I guess it will have been home to lots of different animals and seals and penguins and things for that time. But eventually it melted enough to lift itself off the seabed, and then it got caught up in the currents, the ocean currents, which circulate around Antarctica, and those have dragged it away now.
And it's the world's largest and oldest iceberg. It's something like twice the size of Greater London, which is where I am right now. So this thing is ginormous, Andrew.
It is. It's a mega iceberg or a monster iceberg, however you want to describe it. It's a whopper. It's 50 kilometers wide and 50 kilometers long, and it's about 400 or 500 meters thick. And we know that because we've tracked it from space in satellite imagery, and we have measurements going back all the way to the 1980s now, thanks to the people that launched satellites back then. And we can measure how big it is, and it's 1 trillion tons, which is a really big number, but it's a number that people can probably remember.
You've been tracking it for a while. Is this almost the most perilously close it's come to really causing some devastation?
So when icebergs in this part of Antarctica set free, they tend to follow a normal route because there is an ocean current which runs from the northern tip of Antarctica to the southern tip of South America. In fact, it's a famous current. Shackleton sailed on it back in the early 20th century when his men and him got stuck on the Endurance in the ice, and he went to try and get rescue. And it takes anything that is sitting in the ocean all the way to South Georgia. And we call it Iceberg Alley now because the icebergs that leave all follow the same route. This one, like previous ones, is heading towards the island. And that becomes a worry because of the animals that live around there. And this one in particular is a pretty strong iceberg. It's been around for 40 years. We know it can sit on the seabed because it did that in the 1990s and 2000s. And so it's stronger than most. So it becomes a bit more of a worry because it could stick around longer.
When you say stick around, what do we mean? I mean, is it moving at some hurtling pace? Will it crash into South Georgia, or will it just be kind of nearby, maybe resting on the beach, just being a nuisance?
It's more like the latter. Icebergs, they move faster than glaciers, but they're still slow, and it's on a collision course. But you really want to watch a stop motion version of it because it's taken a long time to leave Antarctica and get up here. It'll be there around the island for a good few weeks more before it gets as close as it can. The last iceberg, which we tracked, that worried and bothered South Georgia, it ended up getting stuck about 75 kilometers offshore. This iceberg is thicker right now, and if it gets stuck, it's probably going to be further away than that last one. But if it hangs around in those warm waters and melts some more, it could get closer.
What do you mean by getting stuck? It's in open water. What's happening? What's it getting snagged on?
On the seabed, and around Antarctica, in the deep ocean, the sea floor is maybe 3 kilometers below the surface, right? And it's really deep. But as we move towards an island, and the island pops up above the sea surface, around the island, the land is shallower and shallower, and eventually it gets above sea level. That's when we see islands. This iceberg is going to get close enough, but it'll probably get stuck on the seabed. That does still cause a problem for lots of different reasons for the animals that live around the island. And so people who study those animals, and actually just people like you and I who care about penguins and seals anyway, are worried about it because of what might happen.
So we know it's happening. We are worried. Is there anything we can do to stop this massive 50-kilometre wide iceberg from careering nearby an island?
Well, there are three main things that can happen. When an iceberg hits the seabed, it's obviously a huge thing, and it can really damage what's on the sea floor. And actually, even though this is Antarctica, there's still a lot of life down there. I've been in submarine dives in Antarctica, and it's amazing how much you can see down there. Things live in the most inhospitable parts of our planet. And an iceberg running into your home is not a good thing, right? So there's not much we can do about that. If it gets stuck, then what starts to happen is the iceberg will melt, and that cold fresh water, that also becomes a problem for the animals that live in the water, the fish that live around it, because anyone that has a fish tank at home knows that the fish don't like to be in very, very cold water. Only certain fish do. But the worst problem is the disruption that a huge 50-kilometre iceberg can cause to animals like seals and penguins, which live on the island but feed in the ocean. And if this iceberg is in their way, they're going to have to swim around it. And that becomes a real difficulty because it's 50 kilometres, right? And that's a lot further to go to get your food. And actually what these animals are doing is collecting food to bring back to their babies. And any extra distance they have to swim means that they will have to consume some of that food for energy and bring less back to their babies. So it's a real problem. We can't shift the iceberg once it's there, but I think this iceberg, since it lasted for 30 or 40 years on the island in the Weddell Sea, this could be around for some time. So I wouldn't be surprised if it does sit there and become part of the landscape, that marine biologists and conservationists will probably try to go and help out.
Well, it's been fascinating to hear all about it. Professor Andrew Shepherd, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
We had 2 collision courses with our Science in the News today. I'm really excited to see where this iceberg ends up and what it might do to the population there. Hopefully not damage it, but all the creatures, and see how they work around it. Thank you very much to Andrew. Now, you might have noticed on your podcast feed recently, we've given you a brand new episode. It's all in. It's the Fun Kids Science Midweekly. See how we came up with the name for that. So that means twice a week are we popping by, letting you know what's happening with science, with just a little update on Wednesdays, more or less. And we'll just see what's happening around the solar system. So if you're not, make sure you're following this podcast wherever you normally get your shows. And you got even more with bonus episodes waiting for you if you subscribe to Fun Kids Podcast Plus. If you're not already there, have a look at getting involved, because you've got episodes every month where I answer your questions and where we have an extended chat with one of our favourite guests. Plus, on Fun Kids Podcast Plus, you've got access to loads of our shows completely ad-free and tons more bonuses too. You can find out more, get to funkidslive.com. And that's the place you need to go to send in your questions, by the way. If you are ever wondering something about science, something you've heard at school, and you're thinking, how can that possibly be true? Really? What are you on? I tell you what, ask me. I will do the digging for you, and I'll even call up a science expert that I know who can really unravel the whole thing. So you send it as a voice note to the free Fun Kids app, or you can do it at funkidslive.com, or a message like this from Elodie, who is in Ashleworth, who wants to know, why do we laugh? Well, scientists think, Elodie, that we laugh for a few reasons. Maybe because something's funny, sometimes out of nervousness, and sometimes it's because everyone else is laughing and you want to fit in. And that makes real sense, because laughing is a social bonding tool. When we laugh, it releases endorphins, which is a chemical. It makes you happy, it boosts your mood, it strengthens our connection with others. It also reduces stress, which makes you happy, which boosts your mood. Experts actually think that the reason we laugh is because we do it out loud. You find funny things all the time, right? If it's just you watching a telly show or reading a book that you love and you're finding it really funny, you might not laugh that loudly because there's no one around. But the fact that you laugh out loud is interesting. It's because you want to show other people that you're finding something funny. Maybe it's a way to show that you're safe, that you're friendly. Through evolution, it would have helped our ancestors make friends out in the wild, because it would have showed that we can trust one another, that we were like each other. A bit like how animals play to build trust. You laugh. It's helped us create groups for thousands of years. Also, we laugh when we're uncomfortable, because our brains love patterns. So when it's expecting one thing, but you'll get another, it'll make you laugh because you don't know what's happening. That's why jokes are funny, right? You get the setup, and then the punchline completely comes along and it turns it on its head, and you don't know what to do. It's really strange, so you laugh. You find it funny. If you're ever at school with a really serious assembly or something, and you see your mate laugh, you'll probably laugh too, because it's what you don't expect to happen. And that is why farts will always be funny. Because no matter what's going on, it'll cut the tension, and it's just something you would never expect. Elodie. Thank you so much for the question. Let's get on another one, probably less farty. This is a voice note that's been sent in by Ashton. What do you have, Ashton?
My name's Ashton. I'm 7 years old. I live in England, and I like to know how do fishes breathe underwater.
Well, Ashton, thank you so much for your question. How do fish breathe underwater? It's good because they must breathe somehow. And we have an idea that it's all to do with how they look and what's on their side. But let's properly find the answer, shall we, with Dr. Colin Bull from the University of Stirling. Colin, thank you so much for joining us. So, let's start with the open goal. How do fish breathe?
Like us, fish have to get oxygen. They have to get oxygen to let their bodies work. And to do that, they have to get that oxygen from the water somehow. And rather like we have our own lungs, they have an organ, a special part of their body that is specifically designed to get as much oxygen out of the water as possible, and that's called their gills. And they have their gills, 2 areas, one on each side of their body, protected by a plate, which allows them to be in contact with lots of water, allows water to be moved over them very quickly and very effectively. And like our lungs, they're made of a tissue that is a huge surface area because the oxygen has to come out of the water and diffuse through a very, very thin membrane into the blood. So as we breathe in, we get oxygen into our lungs, and our lungs work to get that oxygen into the blood. So the gills do the same job.
They've got these gills, and we normally see them on the side, don't we? These kind of little slots that they have. How much do we know about the decision that fish are making to breathe? So when you and I breathe, or Ashton, when you're breathing, we take a deep breath, don't we? Whereas because the water is moving past fish all the time, is it just kind of this non-stop process that they can't really control? What do we know about that, Colin?
Well, it's interesting because they don't always have water going past them all the time. They can sit still. They can be in a pond. They can be somewhere that the water isn't coming past them. So they have to move that water over their gill surfaces. Rather like we breathe in deeply, if a fish is working hard, it has to use its gills to open and close quickly so they can get as much, their operculums they're called, which are the coverings over the gills, have to open and close quickly so they get more water through the gills to get more oxygen out, because their bodies need more depending upon how much work they're doing.
And we see all sizes of fish, from your tiny little ones that you might have in the pond near where you live, or, enormous kind of sharks that float around in the ocean. Is it pretty much the same process, no matter the size of fish?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same system. Blood goes one way through the parts of the gills called lamellae, and it goes in one direction. The water is forced across the other direction. Because the two substances are moving against each other, it's a really great environment to allow the oxygen to come out of the water and into the bloodstream across these very, very thin pieces of membrane. And so, whether you're a guppy or you're a basking shark, you're using the same kind of system.
It just, every time I chat to experts like you, Colin, and we hear about the really tiny things that are happening in creatures, it's just amazing that animals have evolved, isn't it, to be able to transfer oxygen so quickly, so efficiently from the water around you, kind of straight into their blood. I mean, it must blow your mind.
Yeah, it does. And it's also, another really interesting thing about it is that by having those gills in the water, they also risk losing lots of salts and things across that same surface in the gills. So fish that are in the salt water have to do something different to fish in fresh water, because sometimes they lose salts out of their blood through the gills, and sometimes they gain them from the water into their blood, depending upon whether it's fresh water or salt water. So the gills are really, really delicate, complicated, and really highly evolved to do lots and lots of things to keep these fish alive. So it's fascinating.
I don't want to be too gruesome here. If a human accidentally punctures a lung, or instance, there is some way that it means the air can't get in, or perhaps air is leaking.
Yeah.
I know it's not that strict. Is it a similar thing with fish and their gills? Like if there is a hole in this special membrane, would that just mean that water would seep straight in, and that can't be good?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why they've got these coverings over them, the operculums. They're rather like little shields that sit over the gills to protect them. They're so delicate. And it is really an area that can be, attacked by parasites. If there's any mechanical damage, like say it's punctured or broken, it can release blood, and fish don't have a lot of blood to lose. So that can be very bad for them. So they're really delicate areas of the fish, and absolutely essential to keep them alive. So yeah, rather like our lungs, we've got our rib cage around our lungs to keep them protected. The fish have got these operculum coverings to keep their really, really fragile gills protected from any damage.
When we hear about mammals that are under the ocean, like whales, you'll see that they can hold their breath for about 3 hours at a time when they're making these huge dives deep. How much is it the same for fish? Can a fish? I know if they're stable, they might not be getting air in because they need that movement. Do we know if a fish ever decides to hold its breath for a while?
Well, I don't think so, no. Certainly you can tell when they're getting stressed or they're getting agitated because they start to breathe more rapidly. And that's a sign if something's wrong. And often that will lead to, a real problem for the fish. So something for people that keep fish in aquariums, they'll look for that amount of gill activity to see if there's anything wrong with the fish. But I don't know of them being able to hold their breath. They need, like us, we can't hold our breath for very long. We haven't adapted to that. And fish don't have that ability to hold on to air. They need to keep it coming in, so they have their gills active all the time.
And one last question while I have you, and you've mentioned aquariums. I know that maybe you're listening and you might have fish in an aquarium, and sometimes the water can be a bit dirty. It can get a bit green. How much of a problem is that for fish, Colin? Does that, if it's dirty water, does that really stop them from getting clean oxygen?
Yeah, very much. If you imagine if you're breathing in lots of smoke and lots of horrible things in the air, it's not going to do your lungs any good. Rather like the gills of a fish, if it's in contact with lots of things in the water, whether it's little pieces of mud or anything that's in there to make it look dirty, that can have a real problem for fish. So they don't do well in those conditions, and keeping clean water and keeping them in the conditions that they need is really important. So yeah, they don't do well in dirty water.
Well, there you go. Keep your tanks clean. Ashton, I hope that sorted it out for you. Firmed up how fish actually breathe. We know they've got gills, and that's what they do. Dr. Colin Bull, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
If you ever have a question that you want answered next week on the podcast, make sure you leave it as a voice note for me on the free Fun Kids app or at funkidslive.com. Let's get to this week's Dangerous Dan, where we look at some of the weirdest, most unique, oddball, strange, and often deadly things in the universe. And we're headed out to Indonesia, in Asia, to the island of Batanta, to climb a tree and search out the blue tree monitor. It's a lizard with bright blue scales, one of the most strikingly coloured lizards in the world. Unlike most other lizards, it spends most of its time up in trees. It's got this long tail that it uses like an extra limb. It can fling it round branches, hoist itself up. It can use it to push and climb, getting it higher. The blue tree monitor lives in tropical rainforests, where it gets to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, can get to 100% humidity, which is the strongest you can get in the wet season. It's like living in a rain cloud. It's got sharp teeth and strong claws, swiping and scratching to defend itself. It also strikes with a painful, powerful bite, ripping prey or predators to shreds. And that's not all. In its bite, in its mouth, it has bacteria which can cause infections to whoever it strikes. It's fast, it's nippy, it makes it so hard to find out in the wild. But sadly, some people do. They are hunted and they are caught to be illegal pets, which means they're endangered. We need to take care of them if you do spot them in the wild, but don't get too close because they can be very mean and brutal, and that's why the blue tree monitor is going straight on our Dangerous Dan list. For this week's Battle of the Sciences, we are looking inside your mind and how it works and how it affects everything that you do and even the friends that you make. We're talking cognitive neuroscience with Dr. Christelle Langley from the University of Cambridge, who joins us. Christelle, thank you for being there. You have 1 minute to tell us why cognitive neuroscience is the greatest science of them all. That minute starts in 3, 2, 1, go.
Amazing. Thanks, Dan. So I think cognitive neuroscience is the best science because it's the science of ourselves and our brain. And your brain is one of the most amazing things in your body. It's like a super powerful computer that controls absolutely everything you do, from breathing to walking, thinking and feeling. And your brain is made up of billions of really tiny cells called neurons. And these send little messages to each other to tell you exactly what you're doing. And these can be things like how you're remembering, solving problems, learning new skills, or even laughing at someone's really funny jokes. But sometimes the brain can actually get hurt, and this could happen from an injury like bumping your head, or sometimes even from a health problem that affects the brain. And that's where we come in. As cognitive neuroscientists, we study how the brain works and how people recover when something goes wrong. So it's not always just injuries. Sometimes people have problems with memory, depression, or even things that make it hard to pay attention or think clearly. So by studying the brain and how it works, we can create special exercises to help people get better, like memory games or puzzles that challenge the brain to stay sharp. So we not only study an amazing part of the brain, but we also help to get people better.
Wow, there we go. There's your minute, Christelle. Thank you so much. So, in your job, looking at brains, and I know that there's a lot of scientists whose job is to look at brains, how much do we think we know about how our brain works? Because we always hear strange numbers and myths that we only use 5% of its power, but really, what do we know about the brain?
So I can very much say that the myth of 10% of or 5% of using our brain is very much not true. We use our whole brain every single second of every single day. These billions of neurons that I mentioned are always sort of communicating with each other, as I say, when we're talking to people, when we're interacting with our friends, when we're listening to family, we're always constantly using our brain. Now, some of the studies that we use to look at what's happening inside the brain is actually uses something that's called an MRI machine. And this is basically just a very big camera that allows us to look at how the brain is organized. That means even like the microstructure of the brain, as well as how it's working when you're doing different tasks.
Now, we've always known we have a brain, right? Like even people way, way back understood that there was a brain in there. How long have scientists really understood just how important it was? Like hundreds, I know that you're not a historian, but hundreds of years ago, were we like really focused on the brain as this driving force that was controlling everything that we did? Or is it quite a recent thing that we understand just how vital it is?
So I think that's a really interesting question because, yes, as you say, we've known for hundreds of years that we have a brain, but actually how important it is a much more recent development. So even the branch of psychology is only a couple of hundred years old. And then, as I mentioned, this MRI machine that allows us to look inside the brain, that has actually only been developed for the last 40 years. So really, cognitive neuroscience is a very new subject. And I think that's what makes it so interesting because we're really learning new things every single day.
When we learn new things, Christelle, and when we change our mind and we have different opinions as we get older, we kind of think of that as something that can't like be physical. You know, an idea is almost this thing that exists in a cloud inside our head. Is there actual structural change happening in our brain when we learn something new or when we change our mind about things?
So exactly that. I think it's quite interesting that we used to think of the mind as this concept, but it is an organ and it has a physical structure and it's always growing with different things. So one really interesting study that was done by a group in Oxford, Eleanor Maguire, they taught people how to juggle. And actually they saw that after 6 weeks of people learning how to juggle in this new skill, that actually their brain structure and these little connections that help you to communicate with different areas of the brain had actually grown. Something like taxi drivers in London as well. We know that taxi drivers have to know lots of information about where they're going and where different destinations are. And there's a specific region in the brain called the hippocampus. And actually, this region is much bigger in taxi drivers. And that's because they need to remember all these locations in space.
Now, in your job as a cognitive neuroscientist, when you go to work every day, are you just looking at pictures of the brain that this massive MRI camera is taking? Are you setting tricks or projects and tests for us to do? How are you going to work and discovering more about what our brain does?
Yes, so a combination of those things that you've mentioned. Some days it will be taking pictures of the brain with participants. Some days it would be having a look at what those scans are doing. Some days we're also trying to invent ways that we can actually help you get better in different tasks. So something that we've worked quite a lot with is actually cognitive games and making it much more fun for people to actually practice their cognition and get better. So for example, learning or even attention skills that obviously can help children at school. There are now sort of these cognitive games that people can play that have what we call the neuroscientific evidence behind them to actually show that they strengthen these neural connections in the brain and improve performance.
You mentioned how we interact with our friends and how that can change with what our brain does. And I know that you've been part of some research, I think, about the amount of friends that we have and how there is a perfect number to help us grow up and become smarter or something like that.
Yes, to some extent. So I think the interesting thing is that as humans, we are social animals. We have regions in the brain that are entirely dedicated to being social and interacting with other people. A lot of times when we're much younger, this will be our family that we're predominantly interacting with. But then as we age and we start going to school, obviously we become much more interconnected with our friends, and our sort of social group widens a little bit. But some of the research that we've tried to look at is, well, exactly that. How many friends is too many and how many is too few? And as you mentioned, Dan, the study sort of showed that having 5 friends is something that is actually related to brain structure, cognition, and also doing better in school. And part of the reason we think this might be is that if you have too many friends, you're going to be too busy trying to keep up with everyone. And then actually you're not going to be, doing optimally because you're probably spending too much time trying to interact with your friends. Whereas having too little friends can also mean that you sometimes feel lonely. And these can obviously detract from cognition and your well-being.
So it's 5 friends. Just 4 more to go then. Dr. Christelle Langley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dan.
We've heard a lot about the ocean this week in the Fun Kids Science Weekly. We followed an iceberg as it floated towards an island full of creatures a bit earlier on, and we had questions, didn't we, all about how fish breathe. So I thought we'd take another swim deep down under the sea to finish off with an episode of Marina Ventura. This is from her Ocean Adventures series. Marina is an absolute genius. She knows everything about biodiversity and the creatures that lurk around under the sea, and she uses her trusty sidekick Map app to help her with her ocean adventures. And this week you'll need to wrap up warm. We're discovering all about ice.
Hello, Marina Ventura here, continuing my ocean adventure. And today I'm at the bottom of the world on the Antarctic Peninsula. A chilly place, but one that tells us a lot about oceans and our climate. As you know if you've ever made a snowman, when the weather gets warmer, ice and snow melt back into water. And the extra water from melted ice can make sea levels rise. So if we're worried about sea levels, we need to keep an eye on icy places like this. Helps to wear some warm clothing whilst you're doing it. Just like your snowman, things rarely stay the same in nature. Tiny creatures called bryozoans live around the Antarctic coastlines and have been found in places a long way away from each other. This tells us that once the ice that separates them now wasn't there. And more chilling than that, over a number of years, an ice shelf half the size of Scotland has been collapsing. It used to be joined to the mainland by a thin bridge of ice, but in 2009 the worst happened. The bridge broke! This was worrying to scientists because once ice shelves collapse, there's nothing to stop glaciers sliding into the ocean and melting, and that makes sea levels rise. Sometimes seawater frozen to the bottom of the glaciers can help hold things together. Glacier ice is cold and brittle, like chocolate that's been in the fridge. But sea ice is warmer, like chocolate when it's been warmed up. It's wobblier, more flexible, and can stick things together a bit. Not quite as tasty though. Now, we know that the heat that warms the ice comes from around the equator, but how does this heat arrive down here? That's a real puzzle and one for Map App, the electronic essential for every explorer. It's in my rucksack. Hang on. That's not it. I thought I'd packed it near the top. Oh, I wondered where my picnic hamper had gone. Oh, here it is.
Hello. Ooh, it's chilly here. My microchips need mittens.
Hope you can help us, Map App. How does the heat from the equator end up here?
Easy. It's all about ocean currents. Ocean currents move lots of things around, and that could be a message in a bottle, a clump of seaweed, or water warmed up by the sun. Scientists use powerful computers to analyse data from the oceans to tell us about the routes the currents take. It's a tough job. That's why one such computer, called OCAM, has 500 processors to figure it all out.
Amazing. Well, I'm off for a hot bath, so I'll see you next time when we look at how sea life affects the oceans. Toodle pip, adventurers!
Marina Ventura's Ocean Adventure, a Fun Kids production in association with the Natural Environment Research Council, the science of the natural world.
And that's it for this week's Fun Kids Science Weekly. Thank you so much for listening. If you ever have anything sciencey that you want answered on the podcast, make sure you leave it as a voice note for me on the free Fun Kids app. You can do it at funkidslive.com too. And while you're on our website, it's one of the best places that you can get loads of brilliant podcast series. You've heard Marina Ventura today. We've got tons more. It's on the app too, on Google, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. And Fun Kids, we are a children's radio station from the UK. You can listen all over the country on the free Fun Kids app, on our website, and if you've got a smart speaker, wake it up and ask it to play Fun Kids.